Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm going to repeat anything seriously, except thanks to Maxine. I come from a straightforward economic history tradition, and I was very much part of global economic history network GAIN. In a sense, I was acting as an Asian hub. We have had a number of conferences on global history in Japan and other parts of Asian countries. So we have, I think, we can say that in that part of the world also global history has taken off in many ways. I'll just give you a couple of examples. In the last meeting for the Executive Committee of International Economic History Association held at Kyoto last November, we had a conference called Multiple Paths of Economic Development in Global History. Some of the participants are here, and we sort of managed to fit every single member of the executive committee into that theme. In last February, we had a first annual meeting for the Economic and Business History Association of Australia and New Zealand for the first time in Tokyo, involving Koreans and Chinese and some people from California. And again, it's going to be a regionally based forum for global economic history. Finally, next week, some of you are going to Osaka to attend the first meeting of the Asian Association for World Historians. So I think some of these are globalizing in a parallel way. I want to make three observations about the European miracle in modern and contemporary global history. I specialize primarily in late 19th century to the present, so I'm a little bit different from most of you in terms of specialization. But I think that the European miracle that we have had discussed in this panel does have some connections with the more contemporary global economic history, particularly the rise of Japan and Middle East and ASEAN and China, so-called East Asian miracle. And I would like to make three observations on the basis of what we have been discussing in that part of the world, and how could that affect the interpretations of European miracle. You may remember that before Jones, there was the Roscoe and Kuznets impact from the United States, which had changed the interpretations of the Industrial Revolution in England and changed the vocabulary to a very great extent. Whether we are going to see another change as a result of the impact from the comparative global history, particularly between the West and East Asia, we will have to see. But some of these literatures clearly suggest that they have that in mind. In 1980, Jones' European miracle, he had in mind the Japanese miracle, not the East Asian miracle. But the word miracle started with that particular period, with different connotations. Jack Goldstone was part of the California school, and clearly he does have expertise in both parts of the worlds. And Journal of World History has become an important journal. And finally, I picked up Jan Luyten's recent article in Journal of Global History in the hope that he might talk about it. He didn't, but anyway. He talks about things that clearly have relevance to the Great Divergence debate. On the more specifically two-path comparison between East Asian path and the Western path, we have the Great Divergence book starting this debate worldwide, but I think earlier we have had similar discourse in a regional context, and I have been involved in that for some time, and I think we have, in a kind of, merged into the California school. But I have been arguing the existence of the East Asian path for a few centuries with China and Japan in mind, and in a sense it was quite revolutionary for people like me to try and insist that there was not a Japanese path, there was not a Chinese path, but there was an East Asian path. Takeshi Hamashita and Heida Kawakatsu were among the foremost thinkers of this mode. That we had quite tough resistance against this notion. The other feature that we have been struggling with was the linkage between this East Asian path starting in the 17th and 18th century in China and coming to Japan, Tokugawa Japan, and going backwards to China, is to link all these long-term trajectory into the interpretation of the heart of the high-speed growth in the second half of the 20th century. This is a very important, politically and intellectually, an important task from our point of view, and I think we very much hope that we can link our efforts to yours in terms of long-term global economic history. Finally, this is part of the GAIN edited volumes series, but Gareth Austin and I have been editing a book called Labor-Intensive Industrialization in Global History, which deals with not just East Asia and the West, but also India by Tathan Karoy, Africa by Gareth Austin, Latin America by Colin Lewis, and Indonesia by Pierre van der Ende. We now clearly have not just two-pass thesis, but multiple pass thesis based basically on the notion of factor endowments. So I'm going to do just a brief story about factor endowment story. I picked up some of these well-known linkages. This is not the most important, perhaps, interpretation of the European miracle, but this is one of the more frequently talked about linkages. Jan Luyten's recent Global Journal of Global History paper talks about institutional building in the Middle Ages, leading to market and factor market integration. From the point of view of comparing this with East Asia, particularly Japan, the lack of factor market is quite prominent in Japan. So that factor market integration is an important point here. This leads to low interest rates and high real wages in northwestern Europe. Low interest rates is easy to understand. Why high real wages in a particular part of Europe is a more difficult question, but I'm not going to go into that. But when you have both of these, you have changes in relative prices, factor prices. So that leads to labor-saving technology and human capital formation. High real wage in England, particularly in the late 18th century, leads to a search for a new kind of technology, and this leads to the Industrial Revolution. This is easy to understand because this did not happen in Japan. This did not happen in China. This does not happen anywhere. And this is logical. The idea of this behind this is a substitution thesis. Substitution of labor by capital. This is Jan Luyten's words. The mechanism driving this process was substitution. New labor-saving technology used large amounts of capital. Early modern Europe prepared this process without immediately leading to very high living standards, but real wage eventually rose. And it finally made a social impact, proletarianization in England, and classical political economists described it in terms of the changes in factors of production, land, labor, and capital. And these three factors of production have been stuck in our mind for about 2 centuries, including Japanese, Chinese, Southeast Asian, South Asian historiography. Do we have an institutional path supporting these combination of factor endowments in other parts of the world? In Asia, relatively high interest rates, in other words, relative lack of development of capital markets, we had a very highly developed capital market in some sense in Tokugawa Japan, but not in the regional, on a regional scale. There was no capital market, international capital market between Japan and China. Relatively high interest rates led to the more efficient institutions for the greater use of labor. The institutional path was geared towards the greater use of labor and improvement of the quality of labor. We call it labor absorption. And this is the Industrial Revolution path thesis. It's not the same as Jan de Vries's terminology, but I think it doesn't contradict with each other. This is real industriousness that we are talking about, with an extensive use of family labor and the in-house combination of rice farming and crop industry. The direction of accompanying technological path was towards double cropping rather than crop pasture rotation, so that you have less capital accumulation, but more towards the more sophisticated labor institutions. The second stage in the Japanese or East Asian path of economic development was the substitution for capital by labor. In Meiji Japan, the growth of factor markets developed, but it led to substitution in the opposite direction, that is, replacement of capital by labor whenever it was possible. Western technology was introduced vigorously, but with as much substitution as possible by labor because of the comparative advantage. And this I call labor-intensive industrialization, and by that measure alone, this is a major route to industrialization in Asia and Africa and other parts of the world. Today, the majority of manufacturing employment is located not in developed countries, but in developing countries. And there, labor-intensive path features very largely. We are now talking about some kind of alternative explanation for late developers. Relative price signals favored labor-intensive industrialization in most developing countries, while they favored relative price signals, same signals favored capital-intensive one in the late 18th century England and high-wage economies of the West Atlantic economy since the late 19th century. Relative prices decided the comparative advantage of each region and conditioned the direction of the regional path. Multiple paths, in turn, created a further potential for the international division of labor and globalization, and therefore this is an explanation for globalization not from the top, but from various regions and interactions of various regional paths in the world. Finally, I want to say something about resource history, because Keynes' work doesn't really fit squarely into this factor endowment history. He does have an important contribution to make in relation to resource history. The Western technology path aimed at raising labor productivity, in my understanding, in accordance with the classical political economy, which tended towards capital-intensive and resource-intensive technology, but it's not directly related to resource-intensive technology. It was aiming at labor productivity increase. The quality of resources, which is land, summarized in terms of the quality of land. It was interpreted in terms of Ricardian rent. Resource scarcity was assumed to be overcome technologically and institutionally, but not in any other way. Search for resources was a major force behind modern global history in terms of political and military and international relations history. But I think it's equally important that resource scarcity could also generate the development of resource-saving technology and energy-saving technology. And this is not what happened for the last 30 years. Last 30 years, there has been a remarkable convergence between resource intensity between the United States, China, Japan, and Western Europe. But when you look back, you have a story of the development of resource-saving and energy-saving technology in traditional industries and modern industries all over the world. And I think we need to explore that. The direction of technological development in East Asia, especially Japan, since 1945, was towards resource and energy saving. This was cost-dependent because search for resources, particularly oil, was the one, in fact, the most important economic cause behind Japanese aggression in the 1930s. So Japan made a committed policy decision in the early 1960s and led the energy efficiency table for about 30 years. It's now gone down, but this, as a history, this was very important. There was much environmental destruction in China, but her energy efficiency has sharply increased in recent years. For the last 25 years, very clear convergence towards the advanced countries level, although serious environmental problems remain. So we see convergence and divergences in this way. There are two indicators other than per capita GDP that suggest convergence between the two paths, Western path and East Asian path, including much of Southeast Asia. One is education, investment in human capital. There was a little bit delay in South Asia, but certainly much of Southeast Asia has come up quite spectacularly. And the energy efficiency that I have outlined. But there are only, of course, part of the world economy, and the bottom billion remain. Now my own research is concerned with the long-term pursuit of economic development in the tropics. Relevant environmental and social indicators are being sought. I am involved in this Humanosphere project, a very large interdisciplinary project, but I'm not going to talk about that today. Now questions. This was what I have done before the electricity cuts last night. I'm going to add some of these, what I have had. To Ken, I want to ask two questions. I have been wondering the relationship between the point about resource scarcity in the 18th century Western Europe and relative factor price changes for some time. It seems to me that factor price changes based on factor endowment differences does explain at least why England came first in a rather short-term perspective. But the great divergence also points to acute resource scarcity in a rather short time rather than a few centuries' times. And in a sense, the factor endowment story is more generalizable, while resource scarcity is more location-specific and more environmental-specific. I think it is so, even if Crosby is right, that any other temperate zone country could have done the same kind of either damage or influences on the tropics or on other parts of the world. the distinction between the temperate zone and the tropics remains constant, and this is geospherically determined, not determined by any other human activities. So that there was something different between the scarcity of resources and factor price changes, and I would like to ask him how he would interpret the relationship between factor price changes and resource scarcity that he has emphasized in the divergence. I was following him in some ways on the longer term implications of global resource history. I was coming to the more present times. But the more I study, the more I'm convinced that there was a basic differences in resource endowments in East Asia and the West. Basically, Japan was the most land-scarce country in the world in the 17th century. And I think China also was substantially more resource scarce relative to the population and other forms of land compared to Europe. So the second question is that when he talks about divergence, was scarcity really an accident? It may have been an accident in looked at in the short term, but if you are talking about forest history, talking about expansion of cultivation of land in a few century terms, how does that fare? He did talk about global labor history, but when he was talking about wage labor, we have a problem that in Japan, in China, the wage labor is not the majority, and it's not even representative of the poor people. The poor people are normally peasants and tenants. So that the conceptualization is still just started. I don't think we have come anywhere close to quantifying the institutional makeup. So this is, I agree with you that this is a big project, but I think we need to go beyond the statistical or quantification on that. And finally, I have done some Gini coefficient calculations myself, and distribution of inequality in the Madison fashion has got lots of problems. But I think that the way in which you have displayed seems to me, on a casual look, somewhat different from what I could normally get from Madison's figures. And I was wondering if you have incorporated heights and other indicators into global inequality, and if so, how? This is a major development, if you could do that, for the 19th and 20th century, because I believe we have never done that. We have never done that in Hitotsubashi. We have never done that in the United States. So I think it's your invention, and I very much like to comment on that. To Jack, I have read this paper, and I have heard you twice. I think the basic idea I accept. I have a problem of sorting out Tokugawa Japan and China. You have a effervescence period on high king. I mean, you know, sort of even citing my piece. But you don't think Tokugawa Japan was effervescence. I think you could say that for the 17th century Japan, where population grew and quite vigorously. But if you are talking about initial conditions before the Western impact in the middle of the 19th century, it was Japan that was far more institutionally prepared. And I think your definition of effervescence has got a problem there, because I think that what you want to say should include some kind of institutional preparedness, which is not in the paper. So that's one minor comment. The other one is, I wrote down here, did an entirely different set of knowledge building that he had emphasized during the scientific and industrial revolution change the fundamental importance of factor endowment changes. I think factor price changes do direct technological and institutional innovations, and that's my basic standing point. And I know how different the world is between 19th and 18th century and 19th century. But whatever the technological change, so far, at least in the temperate zones, at least in the European history and East Asian history, factor endowments were the key to the understanding of the development. So I would like to ask that question. Thank you.